Hello, majesties and acacia seeds. My name is Goniloc in certain circles, and I'd like to welcome you to another installment of Corrupted Cover Art, a program in which we analyze the artwork used throughout a band's discography and contrive an entirely unsupported meaning of each piece through the powers of misinterpretation. We've already been through the hazards of Italy with our friend's mortuary drape, so I think we're mentally prepared to take on France to meet one of the greatest and most influential traditional metal bands of all time, Sortilège. The band technically uses the French word, but if I need to say Sortilège for an entire video, I'm liable to throw my head back and begin convulsing, so forgive me this transgression. Sortilège was a relatively short-lived heavy metal band active from the early to mid-80s, but their discography to this day puts them at the top billing of the French heavy metal scene, even above similarly styled and similarly talented brethren like Blasphème and ADX. The fantastical power fantasies are about as classic as you can get, and the soaring, emotive vocals manage to make French not only a tolerable, but an enjoyable language to listen to, which is certainly why Chuck Schuldiner of Voodoo Cult and Death fame often cited Sortilège as his favorite band. But Chuck, unfortunately, is gone, and I'm not. If I could switch our positions, I probably wouldn't. Let's take a look at that first EP. This is Sortilège by the band Sortilège. Gracing the cover is a spindly little demon character with the texture of an unwashed rutabaga. His mouth hangs open, he's staggering back on his feet, and he's got his devilishly thin tail tucked between his legs. All characteristics of somebody experiencing fear. But what could cause such a visceral reaction from a diabolical little gentleman that seemingly has this white orb all to himself? The clue that I find essential is in the title. Sortilège is the magical art of reading prophecy. Whether they're using cards or straws or popsicle sticks, a sorcerer could divine all sorts of events that have yet to make their debut in this timeline. Given, of course, that they continuously have access to these magical items, it's useless to roll the dice if you can't read the result, you feel me? Therein lies the problem. Our infernal friend is likely well accustomed to the sweltering heat of the world below, but tarot cards don't do well near open flames, especially when those open flames are radiating off of the sun itself. I couldn't tell you why this fool thought reading the sun's fortune would be a productive course of action, but he clearly wasn't anticipating his deck of cards to crumble into smoldering ash, hence his expression of shock. But I think we've spent enough time with one of the most tightly written trad metal EPs of all time. It's time to hit Sortilège's first full-length album, 1984's Metamorphose, which marked a new trend for the band, simultaneously releasing both a French and an English version of the record. I don't know why I created this visual, they use the same artwork. Now, I wouldn't blame you for pulling a self-titled and recoiling in horror at this news, but even though the songs were clearly structured to accompany French lyrics originally, the English versions, lyrically and phonetically, came out pretty competent. So if your aversion to the French language is that strong, there's still a sliver of hope. But this album cover, certainly more eventful than its predecessor, but still featuring a sorcerer with arms stretched out before him. Per the title, however, we've moved past the Sortilège variety of magic and have arrived at metamorphosis, transmutation, and similarly transformative abilities. The question that remains is, what is the sorcerer transforming? The first indication we see of supernatural activity could actually be any one of these objects, but I'm going to focus on the angular tubes jutting out of this garish blue monster. The tubes are colored with the hideous crimson of arterial blood, and since I'm certainly not here to advertise for the new Carnage movie, playing in theaters nationwide beginning on October 15th, I can only assume that this is, in fact, arterial blood being drained from out of the monster and into the pale, naked woman splayed out near the wizard. Not the most orthodox environment for it, but there's no doubt in my mind that we're witnessing a large-scale blood transfusion. Some of the tubes have been haphazardly thrown into the landscape to let the precious vital fluid leak out in puddles all over the place, but hey, nobody here claimed to be a doctor. Now, Why would this traditionally proportioned individual, whose name I would imagine is something to the effect of traditionally proportioned Penelope, need an entire monster towering over the mountains to supply her blood? Why not another equally traditionally proportioned individual, such as myself? Well, bear in mind, we're not doing a simple hospitalization here, we're doing a full-on transformation. Traditionally proportioned Penelope wants her entire existing supply of blood flushed out so that she can be filled with a new, superior blood type. I can only imagine that she's doing this because she was cursed at birth with type O negative, inescapably associating her with a band notorious for its gay vampire frontman. And that's not to insinuate that there's anything wrong with a vampire being gay. It just seems like the hypersexualization of the vampire mythos that followed in Anne Rice's wake is so commonly projected retroactively onto Bram Stoker's Dracula, a novel that, ignoring modern conventions, has no traces of homosexual themes whatsoever, and perhaps Penelope was exhausted by the way that academia warps the themes inherent in that novel. Meanwhile, Carmilla, which was written even earlier than Dracula, and despite its subdued language is probably as lesbian can get, so often gets thrown into the category of supplemental evidence rather. I'm going to stop myself here, but I think it's reasonable to assume that that's the kind of stigma that Penelope is trying to avoid. But don't go anywhere just yet. We haven't looked at my least favorite album by the band, Larmes des héros. I don't think that's even how you say it, but let's get serious for a minute. Larmes des héros, released in 1986, marking the end of the band's activity as well as departing from the overtly hard rock attitude that the first couple of releases had and slowing things down, going for a slightly more epic feel that works very well. I mean, it's a fantastic album, it's just more mood dependent, and I find myself revisiting it less often. If you're not out of your fucking mind, you'll probably barely notice a shift in style to begin with, but I digress. The cover art, quite frankly, has always kind of bothered me. This is just weird. On it we see a statue of the Greco-Roman variety, complete with haunting inky black eyeballs and a veritable army of river leeches in place of actual hair. Leeches, speaking from experience, have a tendency to bite into your flesh and sloppily slurp the fluids right out of your body, leaving a myriad of punctures and holes in its wake. Truly, the tears of heroes. Now, that joke would have been wonderful if the identical spelling of tears and tears carried over into the French language, but it doesn't. So we're stuck with the title, The Tears of Heroes, meaning we have to redirect our attention to the alarmingly piss-colored droplets leaking out of this repulsive man's eye sockets. But maybe that's not such a divergence. After all, the tears of heroes would reasonably trigger the tears of heroes, and given that this is a statue, unable to produce tears on its own, maybe somebody else, a hero in his own right, left pouches of human urine in the eye sockets to properly simulate the process of crying. I don't know, makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is the fact that after all these decades, Sortilège, this year actually, decided to partially get back together in order to record a new album, made up entirely of inferior modern re-recordings of classic material. It's fine, it's alright, but it's just a strange decision considering that the years haven't been terribly kind to their vocalist's performance. And on top of that, the original albums don't have any issues. There's nothing sloppy, the production's perfectly appropriate. If this new incarnation of Sortilège decides to try their hand at new material, I'd be happy to check it out, but I'm not going to pick a fight over their re-recordings. As the band will tell you, death is the only outcome of a brawl. Well, that's all I've got for this installment. Fare thee well, folks.